Story number 1. Brisk Walker. Submitted by Tweed. This is a peculiar series of events that involved a man who simply walks home. I'm not sure if this person is a ghost, and I don't really know what to think, actually. When I was 10, we moved to a house where I first encountered the dancer. We moved there in late 1991, and Mum moved out in 2007. During that entire time, this guy walked past our house. Nothing unusual in that. We saw him maybe once a week, a few times a week, once a month, dependent on if you were looking out the window at the right time. From this, we can deduce that he kept a routine. We always saw him in the early afternoon/early evening. I never took notes of the times, but between roughly 5 p.m. and 7 p.m. He always wore a black, or maybe it was a charcoal suit, white shirt, carried a briefcase, and I think he wore glasses. He was kind of short, maybe 5'4". His hair was sandy blonde and thick. Also, he had a very brisk walk. He was quick, and his pace never seemed to alter. His consistent walking pace was the most distinguishing thing about him. The first off thing I noticed about this guy was on a hot summer day in about 1996. I was around 15. It was early evening. I was mucking around with the budgie. I saw him walk past, and I thought nothing of it. Moments passed. I realized how hot it was, and how he was wearing a full suit. I thought it was pretty dumb not to have taken his jacket off at least, and wondered how someone could keep a quick pace in this heat. We had seen him walk in different locations around town, around his usual time, always on the same route. His route came from the station. The reason we noticed this is because our house was nowhere near the station, and there were bus routes to take you to our neighborhood. No need to walk all that way. We figured he was choosing to walk for the exercise. So when he walked past wearing a full suit on a 1,000,000-degree day, I was somewhat shocked. I can't remember what was going on, but late one night, in about 1999, Mum and I were standing on the street, just a few doors up from our house, looking up at the stars. Mum's big on astronomy, and often called me outside to check something out. However, we usually stargazed from the backyard or the driveway. Standing out on the street was rare. So there we were at about 11 p.m. And there he was, walking home late. From where we were standing, we saw him turn down a street just off ours. Mum commented that after all these years, she never knew where he walked beyond the point of our place. She also voiced concern about him walking home from the station so late, because there were yahoos hung around that station after dark. I thought about how we'd never seen him in any other context all these years. Apart from it being late, nothing seemed that strange. We continued to see him walk past our house at his usual time after this. About a year later, I was at the letterbox when he rounded our corner. This was the first and only time I saw him up close. Our letterbox was about 5 steps from the corner. I looked up and said, "Hi." There was something bizarre about this moment. I couldn't put my finger on it, and I still can't. However, I was distracted by a fashion catalogue or some such nonsense, and I didn't heed to any undercurrent. As he passed, I turned to go up the driveway, so I was directly behind him on the footpath. I looked up from the catalogue to where I was going, and he was gone. He should have been directly in front of me, because only a second had passed. I thought, where did he go? These thoughts turned to, where does he go? Our embankment was dense and steep. He couldn't have gone in there. Our neighbour's embankment was equally steep. The houses across the road had visible front yards. I don't know where someone could have hidden within seconds. Today, I still don't know what to make of that. Of all the brushes with odd that I've had, this walking ghost has always been hard to accept as a ghost. I don't know why that is, but I still feel the same today. Also of note, when he suddenly wasn't there, I didn't freak out or anything. Just looked around and thought, cool, wonder if anyone else saw that, meaning the other neighbours. Since that day, we continued to see him pass by our house, as well as in various points around the route from the station to our neck of the woods. He always walked briskly, always wore that same attire, and as the years went on, I became aware that his fashion never changed, and he never grew older. But I suppose that doesn't prove he's a ghost either. Oddly enough, I remember the first time I saw him quite vividly. It wasn't long after we'd moved in, way back in 1991. I stopped whatever I was doing when I noticed some guy walk past our place, then continued to watch this person walk up the road. It was all pretty dull. Nevertheless, I remembered that mundane moment quite well. Ever since that first time, I had these questions like, what is he doing? I guess this feeling is directly linked to the weirdness in the letterbox moment. Since the letterbox day prompted me to question if he was a ghost, more questions beckoned. What motive? And why bother? Was he residual? And I imagined he acknowledged me because I was distracted. If he was residual, surely he would have stopped traffic. There were main intersections on his route. Come to think of it, I never saw him cross any road. In fact, he always crossed the road at a certain point in front of our house, which was obscured by trees. We had a thick mini forest of lily-pillies up an embankment from the footpath. He must have crossed around this section of path, because every time he passed our place, he would be on the other side of the road by the time that he would pass our embankment and become visible. A few years before the letterbox moment, I saw him walk through the station car park, away from the station. But that's the closest I ever saw him to the station. On that day, a group of us, all teenagers, were hanging around outside the Masonic Lodge, opposite the station. We were peering through the gates, making up conspiracy theories about what went on inside. Any excuse to talk about paranormal stuff. You know, the typical crap. His attire and early evening commute simply led us to assume that he was walking home from the station. So, noticing him walk through the car park in the direction of the rest of his route seemed normal. Also, I never saw him at any location before the station on his route. But that doesn't really mean anything either, does it? Oh well. Thanks for listening. Story number 2. Newtown Wandering Ghost. Submitted by Lotus29. I've lived in an old workers' semi-detached cottage in Newtown since 1993. The house is over 100 years old and in a historic inner-city suburb. I bought the house because it had such good and positive energy, and there have never been any paranormal issues while living here. In late 2003, when my eldest son was 16, he got into the habit of ringing me before he arrived home, requesting that I switch the light on at the front of the house and have the front door and gate open for him. He did this over a period of several months, and so many times it got really annoying. He eventually told me after months of this that the reason for the calls was there was a ghost outside the front of our house. As he was a bit of a smartass and liked playing practical jokes, I initially thought he was just pulling my leg. I teased him a fair bit over this. I soon realized he was very anxious and frightened, and would be quite pale when he came rushing in, usually with a big door slam. I told him if there was something in or around the house, I would be the first person to know about it. I did start to notice it when I went to water the front garden in the evening, that the hair would rise on my arms. Though, at this stage, it was just an uncomfortable feeling of being watched. One Friday night, I was home alone, but I could hear my neighbour who shared the common wall opening and closing his kitchen cupboards, and the sounds of activity in his kitchen. My son made the usual phone call and came home, this time saying the ghost was on the next door neighbour's property. I told him to cut it out, that our neighbour was home, and I'd heard him earlier in his kitchen. At this, my son made me go out the front of our house and see if I could see any lights on in the neighbour's house. It was completely dark. He then literally dragged me out the back of the house and showed me that there were no lights on at the back of the house either. There was clearly no one home. About 2 or 3 weeks after this, I was coming home with my younger son, who was about 8 months old. It was early May and late autumn, and the sun was just beginning to set, though it was still light. As I fumbled about in my handbag for my keys inside my own front gate, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of a male figure wearing a grey hat and a long grey coat, gliding into the property next door. I say gliding, as that is exactly what it looked like. Completely soundless. There was no noise from the wrought iron gate opening, which is usually quite noisy. What was really noticeable was the extremely white skin on what could be seen on the side of the exposed face. My neighbour was quite a chatty fellow. He would always say hello, so this was odd and unusual. I stopped and waited, listening to hear the sound of a key in a lock. When I failed to hear anything, I nervously peered over the low wall, and there was no one there. I realized then that my son was telling the truth, and there was something odd happening. I didn't tell him that because he was so freaked out. I didn't want to increase his anxiety. About 2 weeks later, my eldest and I went to see an early movie together. Afterwards, we walked down to our street and were walking on the opposite side of the road, about to cross, when we must have seen it at the same time. Standing outside the front of my neighbour's house. This time, it was very theatrically attired in a Grim Reaper type outfit, the white face glowing in the dark cape-like garment. My son gripped my arm and hysterically said, "Do you see it? Do you see it?" I said calmly, "Yes, I do, but it's nothing to be afraid of. Come on, just look straight ahead. Ignore it. We are going home." With that, we crossed the street, right past it, and went inside. This was the last time my son reported seeing it, and I never saw it again, but for a while, there was a feeling of being watched when I was watering the front garden. I mentally told him that he was dead and he needed to move on to the light. Several months later, I went for a tarot reading with a very accurate psychic reader, someone I had been going to for years. At the end of my personal reading, I hesitated, but I asked her about our visitor. She actually started laughing and said, "This is kind of funny. He's dressed just like the Grim Reaper, and he really gets a charge out of scaring your son." She said that he was quite young and had met a very violent and sudden end. He'd been roaming around the area and chanced upon my son, who would see him. So he started following him around. She also reassured me that some decorative quartz crystal sun catchers in my son's bedroom windows and a crystal in a wind chime were preventing this spirit from entering, which was why he was always standing outside our property. Her description of a young man, a violent, sudden death, and no grave closely matched the details of a highly publicized inquest that was occurring around the time. The young man in question had been a prime witness due to give evidence in the case of a major crime ring, and he had been murdered, with the body dumped under a piece of concrete on an industrial estate down near the Alexandra Canal in St. Peter's. The body had been found about a year before this started to happen. It was pretty sad once I worked it out. Story number 3. Bedford Park. Submitted by Jubilee. Bedford Park is a southern suburb in Adelaide, and ideally close to the university in South Australia. When my younger sister, Cara, names mentioned have been changed, rented this apartment in 2002 with her flatmate, Bay, both of them had thought that it was the ideal location to stay while they furthered their studies. They hadn't expected the other flatmate though. During 2003 or 2004, Rex T and I made the long drive from Sydney to Adelaide, across the southwestern Hay Plains, to visit Cara for a few days. When we arrived at Bedford Park, the sun was setting, and I remember thinking that the place looked rather bleak, like a giant block of Lego bricks or a severe hospital building. It wasn't a location I'd have chosen for myself. I was startled by a dark shape racing across the floor in the foyer downstairs. I told myself it was probably a possum or maybe a large rat. I really hoped it was a possum. The dingy foyer felt empty, yet somehow not. I didn't know what I was feeling, only that there was something off. Rex T, practical and to the point as always, said he didn't like the general layout. My partner felt the place was like an office block that had been temporarily converted into cheap student housing, as if it was an afterthought. We had no idea at the time what my mother, Kara, and her flatmate Bay have experienced there. All ghostly activity had quietened down by then, but I remember thinking that her place didn't feel too comfortable during our visit. Since my sister's encounter with the Shadow Man, she and her flatmate Bay had learned to coexist more peacefully with their other flatmate. Then, a few years later, Bay decided to move into the unit upstairs when her sister Debbie came to stay in Adelaide. Their experience was of significance because it had also had an impact on Kara. To Bay's dismay, she soon found out that the second floor unit was even noisier than the one below. Every afternoon, she and Debbie would hear unexplained knocking sounds and loud footsteps throughout the place. They checked with their neighbours on either side and above, but couldn't find any reason for the activity. Once, on Bay's day off, she heard this persistent loud banging coming from inside the unit. She decided to do a thorough investigation to discover the source of the sound and inspect everything in the place. Bay went to the bathroom. The door was properly shut. She glanced over at the umbrella stand in the corner. It was empty. There was nothing in it that could have fallen. The banging suddenly stopped. She continued her search. There was no wayward draft coming through from any gap that might have caused a door or a window to slam. All the windows were closed. Bang! It sounded very much like someone was kicking at the door. She looked at the bathroom where the sound was coming from. The bathroom door was shut. She had already checked that there was no person or animal in it. Then, the noise started all over again. By then, Bay had quite enough. She called on her parents again to have the unit cleansed and blessed by a pastor as well. As it did before in Kara's unit below, the pastor managed to calm everything down. But this time, the peace lasted only for a while. The prevalent feeling about the place gradually reverted back to that of uneasiness and unhappiness. Bay and Debbie went about their daily routine, doing their best to ignore the uncanny activity. Then, one day, their mother Ellen came to visit them. Ellen immediately sensed the other flatmate in the unit with them. She felt that the feeling was strongest in the short hallway just outside the bathroom that joined the two bedrooms. The sisters had hung a mirror on the wall in that hallway. When Alan came out of the bathroom on one occasion, she saw the tall shadow of a man in the mirror. There were no distinguishable features. She could only make out this longish, dark mass. As Alan was only about 5 feet in height, the shadow towered over her by a full head. It seemed to look down at her in a sneering kind of way. It didn't feel at all friendly. The banging sounds started all over again after Alan caught sight of the shadow man. Worried for her daughters, she immediately sent for her pastor to return to the unit. All subsided once more until Bay invited my sister, Kara, for a sleepover. It was not a good idea. After setting up a makeshift bed for herself on the sofa in the living room, Kara tossed and turned all night. She had gotten used to the unobtrusive company of the shadow man in her place downstairs and didn't like the presence that she could sense in Bay's unit. It dominated the entire hallway leading from the bedrooms. There was a pervasive, eerie sense of lethargy and general tiredness that spread out throughout the unit. Kara also felt strangely cold. The season at the time was late spring in Adelaide, giving way into early summer. She had not needed her winter quilt on her bed for a while now, but she was glad she had brought it along. It gave her something to hide under and keep warm. She closed her eyes and she tried to settle, but after lying there for a while, Kara was frightened to feel a heaviness pressing on her chest. She was still wide awake and could move all her limbs. She flailed wildly about, struggling to sit up. Gasping for breath, she couldn't even call out loudly enough for Bay or Debbie to hear. She prayed fervently in her mind for help. As suddenly as the sensation appeared, it left her. Kara sat up on the sofa, resigned. Since she wasn't going to get any sleep that night, she turned on her laptop to do some work and stayed on the alert until the rising sun chased the last of the night chills away. When morning came, Kara told Bay about the incident, informing her that she wouldn't be spending another night there again. She stated, "Your place is not comfortable." Some years later, after everyone involved had graduated from university and moved home from Bedford Park, Kara attended an alumni reunion in Singapore. She met up with Bay, and while they were reminiscing about Bedford Park, her former flatmate revealed that she had met Anne, the previous tenant before them, when Bay had initially inspected the unit. Anne had made a point to ask Bay several times, "Are you sure you want to stay here? Are you really sure?" Bay had chosen not to tell my sister any of this at the time. It could be that Bay really had wanted to stay there because the rent was cheap and the location was so close to the university. She hadn't wanted to scare Kara off with any hint of weirdness, as she needed her help with the rent. It was as if destiny had specifically planned it, because my sister ended up meeting Anne at the same reunion. She took the opportunity to ask Anne if anything had also happened to her at Bedford Park, but Anne was not forthcoming with any details. She was reluctant to talk about her experiences and wouldn't admit that anything strange had ever happened. In 2015, Kara had a chance meeting with Roger, her former landlord from Bedford Park. She and Bay had gotten along well with him. His wife had even insisted that their rent not be increased for all the 7 years that they lived there. Roger told her that he wished all his tenants had been reliable like them. The other tenant in Bay's unit upstairs was an Indian man who seemed extremely sensitive to spirits. He complained within the first week of moving in that the unit was noisy and he could barely get any sleep there. When his wife and young family joined him from India, things became worse for them. He and his wife both said that the unit had a negative feel and their children felt frightened there. Kara asked Roger for more details on the feedback the other tenants had given him. The litany of complaints was remarkably similar. They all felt that the units were already occupied by other flatmates. There were constant banging sounds in the unit on the second floor, and the bathroom was especially noisy in the night. The Indian family only lasted 8 months before they packed up and left, refusing to renew their lease. They told Roger that the unit was just too noisy. I asked Kara if she ever tried to tell Roger what was really wrong with his property. My sister shook her head. All such efforts were pointless, since Roger was a skeptic and a staunch non-believer of all things paranormal, even when faced with the numerous complaints from his tenants. He refused to accept that there was any otherworldly explanation for his problems. He would never believe about the other flatmate, or that his problems came from another plane of existence.